Amid reports that Donald Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff is flying to Moscow, the Kremlin has announced that Russian nuclear missiles are being targeted at Europe. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated that they are no longer obligated to comply with the memorandum banning the deployment of ground-based intermediate and shorter-range missiles. In addition, from August 4 to 8, the Russian Federation closed the airspace over the Kapustin Yar test range. Usually this may indicate ballistic missile tests. And it is during this period that Steve Witkoff will arrive in Moscow. But let me remind you here that after the ultimatum from United States President Donald Trump, the Kremlin responded with threats and recalled the Soviet nuclear strike system perimeter, or as it is called in the West, Deadhead. In response, the head of the White House moved nuclear submarines closer to the Russian Federation. And here the question arises, what is really happening? Should we react critically to the Russian statements about the deployment of medium and short-range missiles? And what is known about the redeployment of American nuclear submarines closer to the Russian Federation? And how is all this connected to Trump's ultimatum to Putin? My name is Alexei Pechi. Next, everything in order. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, write any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Peachy News. The link is below. So, Russia no longer considers itself bound by restrictions on the deployment of ground-based intermediate range and shorter range missiles. Such a seemingly alarming statement was made today by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. I'll quote further. Since our repeated warnings on this matter were ignored, and the situation is developing towards the actual deployment of United States-made ground-based intermediate-range nuclear forces missiles in Europe and the Asia-Pacific region. The Russian Foreign Ministry notes the disappearance of conditions for maintaining a unilateral moratorium on the deployment of similar weapons. And here I would like to point out that missiles with a range from 500 kilometers to 500 kilometers, which during the Soviet era were equipped with nuclear warheads and aimed at European NATO members. Supposedly they were destroyed at the end of the 1980s under the treaty that was signed in the final years of the Soviet Union by Mikhail Gorbachev and American President Ronald Reagan. These are the restrictions that the Russian Foreign Ministry is now referring to. But let me explain right away that there's actually nothing terrible about this news. There are already panic reactions, like Russia has entered a new Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0 is starting. First of all, it was Donald Trump himself who withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty back in 2019, 6 years ago. Why did the United States withdraw from that treaty back then? Yes, because it became known that the Russians had developed a cruise missile version of the Iskander, or as it is also called, the 9M729. This missile was already violating the terms of the treaty, which was signed by Reagan and Gorbachev back in 1987 as early as 2019. And what's interesting here is that even back then, Washington stated that the 9M728, also known as the R500, exceeds the declared range of 500 kilometers. Well, that means it already falls under these restrictions and shouldn't have been created. But now, as you understand, it doesn't matter anymore. Considering that Russia has tested the Oreshnik missile with a declared range of 5,500 kilometers, that's already the maximum limit under this treaty. And back then, in 2019, Russia deployed Iskander ballistic missiles in the occupied Ukrainian Crimea for the first time. After 2019, Russia acted like a noble knight. And there was supposedly a voluntary Russian moratorium on the deployment of intermediate range and shorter range missiles. But as you understand, the missiles didn't go anywhere. It's funny that with the start of the full-scale war, Russia threatened to withdraw from the moratorium on the deployment of intermediate range nuclear forces missiles every 6 months or even more often. Because of the supply of long-range weapons to Ukraine? Despite discussions about Army tactical missile system and Storm Shadow missiles, it was ultimately just empty talk. Finally, they withdrew from this agreement, though it hasn't been effective since 2019. And this is where the Kremlin's entire nuclear bluff was exposed. Notice how, as soon as Donald Trump gave the order to move the nuclear submarines, as he put it, to the appropriate regions, In response to the threats from the alcoholic Medvedev, the Kremlin decided to respond harshly to the Americans and lifted the ban on deploying intermediate and short-range missiles. Well, now nothing is stopping Russia from bringing those very missiles, for example, to Belarus. So, basically, we're hearing new threats from the Kremlin. There's actually nothing new here. And the missiles haven't gone anywhere. And formally, the fact that Russia supposedly self-restricted itself from deploying these missiles was just on paper. The Iskanders haven't gone anywhere all these years. So basically, it was just a formality. Does this change anything? Actually, no. Let me remind you, back in the summer of 2024, the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, ordered the resumption of missile production that falls under the intermediate-range nuclear forces category. Next, I'll quote an old statement from the dictator Putin from 2024. The United States, under a fabricated pretext, withdrew from this treaty and announced that they would produce such missile systems. We need to respond to this and make a decision about what we should do next in this regard. Apparently, we need to start producing these strike systems. And then, based on the actual situation as it develops, make a decision about where to deploy them, if necessary, to ensure our security. At the same time, it's important to remember that Donald Trump said he ordered 2 nuclear submarines capable of carrying nuclear warheads to move closer to Russia. This happened in response to the insane threats made by former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. I won't retell the whole story, I'll just quote Trump. I ordered 2 nuclear submarines to be deployed in the appropriate regions. Just in case these foolish and provocative statements turn out to be more than just words. Words are very important and can often lead to unintended consequences. I hope this won't be one of those cases. Medvedev was talking about nuclear weapons. When someone talks about nuclear weapons, we have to be ready for it, and we are fully prepared. Already on Saturday, August 2, the President of the United States said in an interview with Newsmax that United States nuclear submarines are already closer to Russia. As Trump noted, Medvedev said several very bad things. Speaking about nuclear weapons, Trump emphasized that the United States must always be ready. So he sent 2 nuclear submarines to the region. Already on Sunday, August 3, journalists asked Donald Trump whether the 2 nuclear submarines had already been deployed somewhere near Russia. Trump replied, quote, "The nuclear submarines, which were previously ordered to head toward Russia, are already where they belong." And this is funny, but Kremlin spokesperson Peskov has already stated that Russia does not want to get involved in nuclear rhetoric, and Moscow is not interested in escalating the situation. Now, quoting Peskov, "In this case, it is obvious that American submarines are already on combat duty." This is a constant process, that's the key point. In general, of course, I wouldn't want to get involved in such a debate in any way, and I wouldn't want to comment on it in any way. We are very careful with any statements related to nuclear issues. President Putin's position is well known. Russia pays very close attention to the topic of nuclear non-proliferation. We believe that everyone should be extremely careful with nuclear rhetoric. How do you understand it? This is being said by a representative of a country where the former president openly and publicly threatens nuclear strikes against another country, and this so-called country has sent tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. And right after Peskov's statement, the alcoholic Medvedev wrote another long post on social media, particularly on the social network X. And here is his quote. "The statement by the Russian Foreign Ministry about lifting the moratorium on the deployment of intermediate and short-range missiles is a result of anti-Russian policy. This is connected to the new reality that all our opponents will have to reckon with. Expect further steps. In summary, the Russians are an incorrigible people. To put it mildly, I'll leave it there." Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video or by scanning the QR code on your screen. I appreciate any support. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.